Yes. Now it is time for reading with Ben. And I'm going to be reading what, in my opinion, is the most tragic and upsetting chapter of Francis of the Filth. Now, keep in mind, this is subject to opinion, and this is my favourite chapter, and also the saddest chapter. My favourite character is Salamander Man, so you know. So here we go. Chapter 11. The cold passed reluctantly from Earth. Shit, hang on. Crap. The cold passed reluctantly from the earth. The retiring fogs revealed a world of cool, dark waters. Frank stood knee-deep and gazed about him. The mist slowly shifted backwards and forwards, filling and emptying spaces, at times opening to reveal still waters all the way to the horizon, and at other times wrapping in a thin blanket of vapour. Above him was a white canopy of smoky ether. Beneath him only waterlogged sands. There was not a sound. It was only when he walked that the soft swish of swirling waters broke the silence. Without any sense of direction, he moved, pausing momentarily when fogs lifted to listen for anything, any voice, any bird song, any call of the wild, even the moaning of the wind, but there was nothing. It was during one of these pauses that he noticed a black feather clinging to the sleeve of his shirt. And then he remembered the final moment of his last passage. Percy the pigeon had so desperately tried to join him, but failed by a whisker, or a feather, as it turned out. Frank affectionately curled the feather and put it in his pocket, as a reminder of this brief time in fuck you. He would remember it fondly. His discharge, however, seemed to go on for an eternity. Of all the places he had visited, this one seemed the most desolate in terms of presence, time, and chromosomes, other than the icy island where he had first met Pink Guy. There was no sense of life, no sense of environment, and no sense of value or purpose. The only thing this place had, other than the water, was a musty stench of emptiness and an overriding atmosphere of utter morbidness. Yet, in his lonely solitude, he was unwilling to call out or bring undue attention to himself. He hated to think what might be lurking in the mists. He bided his time. It was after he had been wading through the unchanging waters for what seemed like many weeks of earth time that he finally heard a sound. It was a soft wail, coming from one in the final throes of asphyxiation. Frank headed in that direction through the mists of the region, as thick as any he had encountered in that place, kept him from seeing anything. The groans became more and more audible, and by the time he arrived at their source, he was standing at the foot of a tall wooden pole which ascended into the clouds. As they parted, Frank, still capable of fear, was mortified to see a creature impaled at the top of the pole, lacerated, writhing in pain and struggling for breath. It was a reptilian creature, and it slowly turned its eyes to Frank. They were dark, desperate eyes, full of longing for death to finally come and bring an end to its suffering. Its body occasionally quivered with pain before lying limp again in the hope that it was its final heave. It never was. Mercy was entirely absent in this place. Frank reached up and touched his foot. They locked eyes for the briefest moment before Frank asked, "How long have you been here, my friend?" No, I'm not going to do that. "How long have you been here, my friend?" The creature wheezed as though trying to make an effort to respond, but never came close to articulating a reply. With a sorry pat of the creature's foot, Frank moved on. There were others. Some were reptilian appearance, others were avian-esque, and some still of a wholly unknown existence to Frank. All were impaled on poles, while some had seemed to have finally withered and died, most were suffering excruciating agony, moving closer to a slow, painful death, yet ever actually being able to taste any relief that the finality might bring. Some were able to gasp utterances in their tortured breathing. It was all through them that they was able to learn little of this nether realm. This was, they told him, a place for the pre-wretched, a purgatory of prolonged pain for those who had been condemned and were awaiting their final destiny of the pits of either eternal damnation. Frank could feel their pain. He could smell their agony and taste their anguish, yet there was nothing he could do about it. One of these creatures was amphibious, a sliced, bleeding salamander, occasionally twitching and groaning, yet mainly hanging limp on his pole, staring down at the visitor. At first Frank was horrified to think this might be Salamander Man, but this creature was of different shape, and its colour was significantly older than his good old friend. Frank asked him if he knew Salamander Man. Yes, came the soft reply in between gasps, though it took time, of which they had plenty, and tremendous effort on the old Salamander's part. He was able to reveal much to Frank. He shared liberally with Frank about his background, that of Salamander Man and the whole community of Caudata clans. Though it pained him to speak in length, he gave it his all to do so. Theirs was originally a realm of harmony. All the salamanders, as well as the neighbouring newts, mud puppies, water dogs, and even sirens, and even the more distant geckos and chameleons, got on well and allowed each other free passage from one area to another, if not actually actively encouraging others to share a meal, spent an afternoon together. Hospitality was a commonplace, and music was the essence of any gathering. Salamanders had extraordinary musical gifting and assembled a very large catalogue of tunes over the years. Their musicians and composers were second to none in the Caudata role, and were the envy of many. But then the tears started to shine, the old salamander wheezed. You would know this well, Frank, but what you might not know is the changing of the tears. So it was thought originated with the sirens, specifically their leader, Serendipity. He believed for some reason that the sirens were unlike the more common Caudatas, not for their appearance, which was quite ugly to be perfectly frank, but for their intelligence, which was evolving at an undeniably quick rate. Serendipity made friends with higher powers and was poised to rise from his already elevated status of rank and file to Chimpilla, not by his own doing, I must stress, but by his associations. I was one of the few who opposed him. Such elevations should not be done, I told him. It was against the natural order and likely to have serious repercussions right across the omniverses. I mutinied. For that I was struck by Terminus, a peace lord of immense power and authority. He punished me and cast me into this place, which I have been here for ages and remain here until I finally perish and enter the sea of the wretched. He slumped as he said this, both from the effort required to speak and very thought of such a demise. After an unhurried pause, he turned back to Frank. Seamus, whom you call Salamander Man, was the finest of our musicians, he said, continuing. Terminus wanted to end him too, because of his musical capability to rouse the salamanders to a cause, but he escaped to another realm and hid there till you came along, Frank. It was then we all knew that there would be some purpose of it all. The shifting of the tears, unstoppable though it had become, he held some promise. He lifted a weary finger to his left nipple and gave it a soft rub. Yes. How did you know about me? Frank asked. Salamander Man told me last time he was here. How did you know about me? Frank asked. Salamander Man told me last time he was here. When was that? He visits me regularly, every 1,000,000 or so years. Frank thought about that. The old salamander continued to struggle, but Frank could piece together the rest. Salamander Man would come to stay with by his old friend's side and play tunes on his recorder to soothe him, despite his sorry condition, or perhaps full of it. He felt tremendous gratitude to Salamander Man for this kindness. Indeed, just the thought of him returning to play another tune on his recorder was what sustained him through the long, dark eons. There was a long pause as they both reflected on this. "But that might not help you, Frank," the old salamander added. "Why not?" "Because he no longer has his recorder, of course. I doubt he will come back here." "Why would he sell his recorder? It's everything to him." "For you, Frank. He was looking for you. He didn't have enough chromosomes to look for you and comfort an old dying Caudata as well, so he chose you over me and sold his recorder for chromosomes to find you." Frank was moved. "I told him to," the old fellow continued. "There is no hope for me, but for you, Frank." His voice trailed off and he slumped it once again. Memories of New York came rolling back to Frank. He remembered Salamander Man playing his recorder and how happy it made them all. The jolly tunes which led them into long nights of dancing and merriment. The laughter and silly joking, the friendship and the farting. How he longed for those days. But he also remembered the tales that Salamander Man told him. He remembered that now, and although it seemed to be silly nonsense at the time, it was making perfect and very sober sense now. "So you don't know exactly if or when he will be coming back?" Frank asked. The old salamander turned a weary eye to him. "Even if I knew for sure he was coming, I wouldn't know then. 1,000,000 years? Time means nothing here." He fell again in a manner that suggested he wouldn't be reviving any time soon. This introduced the dilemma that Frank was now faced with. He was about to wait 1,000,000 years in this realm until old Salamander Man showed up, or was he to give up on Salamander Man altogether? He considered these options very carefully. Sorry, I dropped the book. He considered these options very carefully and weighed all the possible outcomes in his mind. In the end, he decided in his heart that life would have little meaning without Salamander Man by his side. He also had faith that Salamander Man would remain true to his old friend, a secondary matter not insignificant. Frank was unlikely to be found in this realm, and so he felt his safety was assured as he waited. He chose to say. In the 1,000,000 years that followed, Frank fell into a dormant state. He sat chest deep in water, leaning up against the pole upon which the old Salamander Man was hanging, deeply entranced. He was neither aware of anything in his surroundings, nor of anything within himself. His own existence was as though in distant memory or future dream, and amniotic waters preserved him, and the still air sustained him. And in this period of absence, two things happened. Frank aged, and his chromosomes, free from contaminating influences, multiplied beyond measure. On a cold, lifeless day of endless shifting mists, vacant auras, and soft groans, exactly like any other day in this realm, the sound of someone wading away in the distance interrupted the stillness. The sound came closer and in a direct line, as though they were somehow able to navigate this place. There was a determination in its steps. On reaching the pole, the figure passed and stood patiently, silently eliciting a response. It took some time for Frank to awaken, and when he did, it was in foggy phases. His eyes were fully open and his cognition returned. He looked up to see the white figure, angelic in appearance, gazing down upon him. In this land of shadows, it radiated light and had an overall continuance of glory. The atmosphere of this place seemed to have come alive in the presence of the figure. Its green head bobbed to one side. It stood, slowly and purposely rubbing its nipples with fingers and uttered the only greeting it could under the circumstance. "Yes, Salamander Man!" Frank jumped up, full of excitement and joy, splashing about in the calm waters and calling out in a loud voice, "Salamander Man! Salamander Man!" From an elevated position, however, with his mind having progressed into its initial groggy state, he was disturbed to see his harrowing sight before him. Salamander Man, far from being a picture of radiance and light, was an abysmal figure. His body was lacerated all over and was bleeding terribly. He staggered as he walked, struggling with short breaths, yet his face which carried a greater tragedy. Normally mischievously spiritly, he carried a continuance that was forlorn and wounded and deeply ashamed. He looked at Frank through sad eyes, and the two of them stared at each other in silence for the longest time. To ease the sadness, Frank produced Salamander Man's recorder gently in his right nostril and played a slow, final tune for his old friend. Wait, never mind. Shit, fuck. Hang on. Frank produced Salamander Man recorder, which invoked a hint of smile on the Caudatta's face. He held it lovingly in his hands and then looked up at his old friend impaled on the pole. He played a final tune for his old friend. The old salamander knew that this would be the last time he would hear any music, let alone the sweet sound of Salamander Man's recorder. A large round tear fell from his eye and ran down his face. Salamander Man, too, shed tears as he played, and his tune was occasionally mirrored by the heave of one in great sorrow. Frank stood by the side, with his head bowed in a spirit of respect, and embraced the moment. When Salamander Man was done, he gave his one nipple a little rub, before dropping both hands to his sides and bowing before his old friend. He and Frank turned and left the old salamander to his dreadful fate. The two of them walked away from the watery fields of the gallows, neither saying a word to each other. On the way, they trudged through shallow waters till they could no longer hear the soft groans of the damned. And when they walked some more, always in silence, until there was nothing but an eerie emptiness all about them. There was so much Frank wanted to ask Salamander Man, but couldn't. There was so much that Salamander Man wanted to avoid saying to Frank, so refrained. Frank never learned the cause of Salamander Man's condition, but they understood each other, and that was what made their fellowship, even in the most troubling of matters, so wonderful. At the point where they couldn't go any further into the nothingness, Salamander Man turned to Frank in a quiet voice, said, "Yes." "What?" Frank couldn't believe his ears. "No," he repeated. "Are you kidding me, Salamander Man?" How he could barely contain his excitement, despite Salamander's sorry disposition. "Yes." Back in New York, a small grin edged up the corner of Salamander Man's mouth. Frank was all smiles. "All of them?" he asked. Salamander Man nodded. "Then, my friend," Frank said, "it's time." Frank stopped walking, and Salamander Man drew beside him. "This place is as good as any," he said. Salamander Man agreed, but expressed this without so much as a nod. Frank took him under his arm, and the two of them lay back floating onto the surface of the water. Frank softly called the coordinates into the air. This was once intriguing for Frank and a matter of course. He no longer needed to draw blood for transport, as he was so chromosome rich. He no longer needed to expose his life source to the open air, and coordinates for the destinations of his choice simply came through manual concentration. These things were innate knowledge to him now, like his own name or recalling a familiar memory. When the last of the coordinates had left his lips, they slipped under the water and they were gone. "Oh, Chin Daisuke-daso!" The voice came to him as a whisper first, like a faint dream intended for someone else. It whispered again, this time with great penetration. "Oh, Chin Daisuke-daso!" Frank began to stir. It was the third utterance that brought the horror to life. "Daisuke-daso!" Frank sat bolt upright on his bed. Unlike waking up from a bad dream, Frank had woken up into one where he was terrified. Hovering above him was the creature grotesquely familiar to him. Frank looked over the black halo that encircled its head. At his hideous twitching body and into the vacuum of his demented eyes, he tried to muffle any expressions for hatred of the Dark Lord, but simply wasn't possible. Anger, hatred, and fear seeped out from him, and Chin seemed to feed off it all. Everything from his appearance to his speech to the very essence pushed Frank to release droplets of detestation and rage, and he began to retch. "Chin, Dark Lord, why have you come to torment me? Have you come to... Have you come to send me to the abyss?" Frank asked, paralyzed with panic. "Oh, Chin! but I have made the sacrifices you asked for. The blood and the pubic hair and the nail clippings of 1,000 youths were all duly provided as video evidence. I can show you right now. Dice Castle! Why do you need extra sacrifices? Weren't those I made enough? Frank was quivering with trepidation. Oh, Chin! Oh, Chin! I swear I have no more. I've given you everything I have. I have no more chromosomes to give. Dice Castle! Oh no, Dice! He placed his hand on Frank's trembling heart and wrestled the remaining chromosomes from him. With that, he left abruptly, leaving Frank an empty shell on the bed. Once the shockwaves had subsided and the space-time continuum had returned to normal, fear was gone and life immediately returned to normal in Frank's bedroom. That is, Frank sat on his bed and scratched his balls. He looked around to reorientate himself, then very faintly at first, other activities began around the room. Initially they started with just the lightest of movements from the cupboard door. It budged just a fraction, then a fraction more, then peeped ajar. Finally the little door swung open and jumped out a tiny semi-naked runt, carrying some rosary beads. Alpha Centurion, Frank exclaimed. Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for all your support a minute ago when Chin Chin was here. He waddled over to Frank and sat in the bed beside him. Good to see you too, Frank, you filthy little crapper. Good thing I wasn't here a minute ago when the Dark Lord was here, or else I would have snapped his dick in two. I'd have pounded those creepy black eyes of his all the way into the back of his head. I would have reached into his chest and pulled out his still beating heart and held it up to his face so he could see how black it was. Alpha Centurion, what are you talking about, my lecherous little leprechaun? You were here the whole time hiding in a cupboard. You're such a pussy. Alpha Centurion, Frank exclaimed. Good to see you, my friend. Thanks for all your support a minute ago. Hang on. They repeated the chapter twice. Anyway, Alpha Centurion, what are you talking about? I saw you hiding out in the cupboard. Also, you owe me money. You came up short. The clock on the wall suddenly opened up and from a tiny wrinkled human stuck his head out and said, That was a great joke, Frank. 7 out of 10. They aggressively winked at each other. The little guy returned back to the clock, never to be heard from again. Before the runt could respond, the bathroom door swung open wide, to reveal the sound of a series of disabled grunts, and in hopped a demented-looking guy, pink from head to toe. Pink guy, it's you! You're here too, you made it! You just missed all the action, by the way. You're a pussy too, you know that? You and Alpha Centurion. You're both a bunch of pussies. Leaving me here to face Chin Chin all on my own. I was pretty scary for a while there. At that moment a rustling noise came from under Frank's bed. Come out, Salamander Man, I know it's you. Yes, came a reply as a huge humanoid salamander peeped out from under the bed. Salamander Man, what are you doing under my bed? Have you any idea of the filth that lies there? I tell you, there's some pretty nasty stuff down there. Yes. He pulled himself fully out and immediately began to caress his nipples. He was now completely back to his normal self. All lacerations had healed and his nipples were back to full erection. Whatever morbid woundings he had previously disturbed him, he was back to his normal cheerful self again. Yes, he cried immediately and inserted the recorder into his left nostril and broke into a rousing rendition of a tune from his glory days. Before Alpha Centurion could start dancing to the music, or Frank could compliment him on his playing or his general good looks and sick moves, the door was kicked wide open, and in strolled a strange Japanese man wearing brown spectacles, a Hawaiian shirt, as a safari hat. Wow, he declared. Wow, Franku. Safari man, cried Frank, ecstatic that his whole posse was back once again. I thought you were still back in... No, let's not go there. Suffice to say, being married to a neggy was never going to work out for someone like me. Ha ha ha. She had no pussy. Can you imagine aggressively trying to make a dent in a dry wall with your dick? Not for me. He was shadowed by Drone, who hovered just above his left shoulder. Frank gestured for them all to come together, and they embraced in a tight, passionate group hug, with Alpha Centurion once again burrowing with pleasure into Pink Guy's thighs. You know I love you guys, right? They all affirmed this, but I want my chromosomes back. There was a lot of good-hearted complaining about this, but they all knew it was the way it had to be. Frank had dispersed almost all his chromosomes amongst the posse to keep them Hang on. Frank had dispersed almost all his chromosomes amongst his posse to keep them from the Dark Lord, and this made him feel like kings of the world, brimming with life and power and authority and worth. As Frank embraced them all, he took back his chromosomes, and a friendly murmur of disconnect spread amongst them. Yet he was okay with this. They knew who Frank was and who he was becoming. They understood the honor that was theirs. They knew they were friends of Frank, his fellow friends of Filth, his posse, and this was more than enough for all of them. More so, they started to believe. They believed Frank was much more than they had once known, and would yet be more than he was now. They had seen him overcome the Dark Lord, feigning fear and covering up the chromosomes. And the Lord, he had handled the Peace Lord in a masterly fashion. He had just confronted the mighty Chin, and there he was, not just alive, not merely unscathed, but composed, rugged, and possibly chromosome-rich. And though they believed now that they were not willing, they were not yet willing to speak of it. Frank, the mere mortal who had shaken the omniverses by becoming a rank and file, had in his travels risen to the tier of all of the mighty Chimpillas. They knew that full well, but now Frank had ascended. He had become. It was too much for them to utter, but they believed it. He owned, rejoiced in it. And it was so on that softly lit autumn afternoon in New York that Frank, Alpha Centurion, Pink Guy, Salamander Man, and Safari Man, and Drone came together to celebrate their triumph over Chin, and look forward to seeing the gay and merry days which lay ahead. With 6 of them now together, the circus was pretty much complete again, and there was a jubilation until late into the night, when everyone laughing, dancing, and farting. Yet for Frank, his deepest dilemma remained, and his interest was still aroused. Who was he, and what was he becoming? He understood that power without purpose was corrosive, and he was now fully aware that the chromosomes were not simply being added to those he had already possessed, but that his own chromosomes themselves were truly multiplying exponentially. He marveled at this, yet remained greatly troubled by it. Despite his increasing displays of power, he seemed no closer to finding out why he had such power. There had to be more to this. Beyond the Peace Lords, there had to be a tierless one, a supreme power, an ultimate God. The ultimate God. Frank was exhilarated and haunted by this thought. He was more determined than ever before to find him, confront him, and demand the answers to his questions. And so his quest became all-consuming. Well, there you go. I read my favourite chapter of Francis of the Filth. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye, lol, xddddd.